Hey everyone, Steve from Backcountry Gallery here. This time around, I'm going to do another how to nail the shot video. This time it's going to be the Costa Rica edition. I'm going to share 8 photos with you that I took while down in Costa Rica over the summer of 2021 and kind of the challenges that each photo presented and how I handled them, as well as some exposure settings and autofocus settings and all that good stuff. So we're going to get to that in just a second, but before we do, I am going to kind of do something I normally don't do. I'm going to talk about a little off-topic item here just for a moment, and that is the Nikon Z9. Since my last video came out, the Nikon Z9 has hit the market, and I do have mine, and I am going to do a review. I've gotten a lot of comments and questions about that, and I didn't want the comments and questions for this video to fill up with Z9 stuff. So I am definitely going to do a review. It is going to take a little while though, because I don't run out for a day or two with a camera in a local park and say, "Ooh, look, I have a review." I realize that's the normal for most YouTubers, but I do take the camera out and I do use it for at least 2 or 3 months before I do a review. I'm also going to update the Nikon autofocus book for mirrorless to include the Z9. That'll be coming in the coming months as well. And I'm going to probably have some setup guides and stuff coming your way for the Z9 as well. So lots of stuff, but I just kind of wanted to answer that question before we get too far into the video, because I know it's going to be in the comments if I don't. So anyhow, let's go ahead and jump right in. And our first picture right here is a female caracara. She's flying right at the camera. And we were fortunate. We found a group of these caracaras that were very active. And they were actually kind of in a farm field. There's a pair of farm fields. They were side by side. A road went right down the middle of them. These caracaras love to hang out with the cows because they kick up insects and that for them to eat. This one was on a gate, and I figured it could be a really good takeoff shot. So what I did is I grabbed my tripod and gimbal. I usually use that for my flight shots. And I kind of set myself up thinking about 2 strategic things. The first is that I wanted to get the bird coming towards me, so I wanted the wind, such as it was, to be at my back, as birds usually take off and land into the wind. The second consideration was the background, because this was out in a field, so there were some areas with trees, but most of it was open, so I didn't want that open area there because the sky was just like a white, bright overcast that day, and I didn't want just a white background behind the bird. And I'm not, even on a blue sky day, I'm not fond of just a blue sky background. I like to have some terrestrial background in there, like some trees or something. So I was thinking, when I was positioning myself and putting the tripod down, I'm thinking about both the background and the direction of the wind for this takeoff shot. And I found a nice spot that worked for both of those things. As you can see with the photograph, there's no like hot spots in the background, no white in the background. And that's going to be kind of a common theme throughout this video, is especially in Costa Rica, whenever you're dealing with animals that are off the ground, especially in trees, you always have to watch for those really bright white spots behind them. I realize it can happen with animals on the ground too, but it's more problematic when you have animals that are higher up, because the problem is your eye likes to go to those bright white spots. And if that happens, it's going to take the viewer's eye away from your subject. And I don't want people looking away from that beautiful bird here. I want them to look at the bird, not at the white spots. So I was thinking about that real hard as I was trying to position myself. And fortunately, as you see, I found a nice location. As far as settings go, this is pretty straightforward. This is a Sony A1. All of these are going to be with the A1. That's the camera I took down to Costa Rica last summer. And this was with the 600, 1/3200th of a second, which is kind of my favorite bird in flight shutter speed. And in this case, we actually even had a little bit of wing blur with 1/3200th of a second. And usually you get a little bit, but this is a little bit more pronounced than normal. When I love it, it looks really cool. So I'm very happy about that. I'm at f4 here. Probably could have talked me into doing 5.6 here, but my ISO is already at 2000. 5.6 puts me at 4000. And I would rather have the fast shutter speed than the little bit extra depth of field, because honestly, I don't think it made much of a difference in the shot. Manual with auto ISO, which is my normal exposure mode here. And I'm using multi-point metering, which is basically like a segmented meter in Sony. It's like, if you're a Nikon shooter, it's matrix metering. Canon, it's evaluative or segmented. I'm not sure which one they call it, but it's all basically kind of the same thing. The camera's looking at the whole scene. So when you see multi in here on the captions, that's what I'm talking about. No exposure compensation. Everything was pretty middle tone here. And for autofocus, I was using Sony's center fixed tracking mode. And normally I don't use that anymore. This was the first time I had taken the A1 on a big trip, and I was still kind of experimenting with some of the autofocus areas. But tracking essentially works the same no matter which one you're using in the Sony once it gets on the subject. So my strategy is to get on the subject's face whenever I'm in a situation where I have a bird that's perched or an animal that's about to run or a bird that's about to take off. I get on the animal's face, and hopefully the camera at least sees the face, if not the eye. In this case, it saw the eye too. And then I just kind of keep my autofocus pressed until the bird takes off, and then I track it and as it flies, and that's exactly what happened here. And as you can see, worked out real well. Nice sharp eyeballs. So next we have this yellow-throated toucan. He's coming in for a landing on the tree there, and I really like the shot, but it was kind of a really unusual circumstance. We were actually heading to another location. We're going down this awful, absolutely awful dirt road, huge ruts in it. Dennis, my guide, he was driving, and I'm sitting there, I'm just watching the road with him because it was really treacherous. My wife was in the back seat, and all of a sudden she yells, "Toucans, toucans!" So we stopped and we looked and we see all these toucans. There's probably 20 or 30 of them at least, and they're flying around between the trees. And what was really cool, the reason this was so unique, is most of the time when we find toucans, they tend to be like in heavily forested areas and not really out in the open. So even if you can get them flying, there's branches in front of them, there's busy backgrounds behind them. It's really problematic. But in this case, we were kind of in a hilly mountainous area, and there were just kind of scattered trees that were at eye level. And oh my gosh, it worked out so well. They were flying back and forth, chasing each other around a little bit. And it really was a unique opportunity, and it was definitely something we stopped for. Even though we kind of had a schedule to keep, sometimes when those unique opportunities crop up, you really need to just kind of stop what you're doing and make sure you take advantage of them. Now, in this case, I used the 600 millimeter with a teleconverter because the birds were a little bit far away, and I wanted to make sure I was filling the frame as well as I could. And in this case, it was actually pretty good. This is a 16:9 crop. I just, on the computer back home, I just cut the top and the bottom off and maybe 20% off the right-hand side. So this is a pretty frame-filling shot, which it's a good thing because I was actually at a pretty high ISO there. I wouldn't want to be up at ISO 3200 if I was really cropping heavy. I do have some articles about that. If you want to look at them at my site, just search when you're on my site for cropping and you'll see all sorts of different explanations as to why that's a bad thing. But the big takeaway here is the more you fill the frame, the higher the ISO you can get away with, and the better that higher ISO takes noise reduction because there's more detail to work with. When you have a bird that's really, really tiny in the frame, and then you say, hey, I need to noise reduce that, all of a sudden the feathers just turn to nothing but mush. There's nothing there. There's no detail. There's not enough detail to begin with, and the noise overwhelms the feathers. And no matter how good your noise reduction software is, if there's no detail there, it can't recover something that doesn't exist. So the more you fill the frame, the better off you are. So that's probably the big lesson here. I could have used the 600, and I realize a lot of people probably would have because the bird looks kind of okay in there. But I put that teleconverter in there so I get that little bit of extra magnification to get a little bit better quality shot. As for the rest of it, it's the same as we had before, manual with auto ISO, no exposure compensation. This time, my autofocus area was zone, and basically it wasn't zone tracking. I would use zone tracking now. Again, kind of learning the camera on this trip. But it was just regular zone, and IAF was active, and it did just an absolutely phenomenal job on these. We had so many keepers from this, but I kind of liked this one the best simply because I like the juxtaposition of him with the tree. I think it balances the composition out quite nicely. So this is the one that got the nod from me. Next, we have this adorable little squirrel monkey. I really love these guys. They're so cute. We shot him with our workshop group, and a lot of times squirrel monkeys are tough because they're usually in kind of thicker stuff. But in this case, there was kind of a hill, a little bit of a valley. There's two hills and then the valley in the middle. And there's a single tree there in the middle. And they would go from one side, they jump to this tree, and then they jump over to the other side of the hill. And we had this distant background. And the cool thing about it is that monkeys, a lot of times, if one goes one way, the other is going to follow, and then the next one, they're going to play follow the leader. It's going to be one right after the other. They're going to take the same path. And that happens with a lot of animals, so always watch out for that when you have multiple animals. If you're trying to get some photographs of them, see if they're all taking the same path because it can give you a hint as to where to be. And that's what happened here. The monkeys were jumping to this tree. They were walking over to where he is right there through those leaves you see, and then they would jump to the next hill. But they'd pause just a second before they did so. So what I did is I went over there, put my 600 on, checked it out, decided I needed more focal length, put a teleconverter on, and created this composition with the idea of going 16:9. This is not cropped at the sides. This is just top and bottom. So I pre-visualized the shot that I wanted and didn't just center up the monkey. I made sure that he was where I wanted him in the composition. I thought I'd balance him out with the leaves, and I think it worked out pretty well. But that's the kind of stuff you need to think about when you're out there. But anyhow, I missed a few of them. They would come and they would go, and I wouldn't quite be on it yet, or they wouldn't look at the camera. But finally, I had one that looked straight at the camera, got the shot, had about a second to do this, I think. And then he finally leapt off there after I got my shot. But the timing was really, really nice on that. And I think it makes for a real nice shot. The distant background, again, is helping out quite a bit here. Makes it so that it's not distracting at all. And if you notice, once again, there's no bright spots back there. I'm always looking for that stuff. So when I positioned myself, I made sure I didn't have any bright spots behind him. As for the rest of the settings, I'm at 3/20th of a second because honestly, once they stop, they're pretty still. And since I'm on a tripod, I can get away with a little bit lower shutter speed. And I mean, why not get that lower ISO? Because this was only an ISO 1250, which isn't too bad when you consider we're in Costa Rica. Once again, manual with auto ISO, but this time one stop of negative exposure compensation because the background was a little bit on the dark side and the monkey wanted to blow out. So I decided to go -1. It worked out just right. And as far as the autofocus area goes, I'm using the wide autofocus area on the Sony, which is like auto on Nikon or Canon. And I have IAF enabled. So the idea was that when the monkey got there, I'd press the autofocus button and it would see the eye and get the picture. And that's what happened. Now, that, again, is not a strategy I'm still using, though. That was still kind of learning the camera strategy. It still works pretty well, but anymore I do tend to use a little bit smaller area so that I can kind of get the camera looking in the spot that I want. I have noticed that these mirrorless cameras, if you give them too much to look at, sometimes they'll find eyes or other areas they want to focus on, and that's not your intended target. So I tend to use a little bit smaller AF areas now so that I can say, hey, no, look over here, look for the eye in this smaller spot. So, but this worked out real well. One of the keys there, though, is to make sure you're kind of pre-focused at where you expect the animal to be so that when it does come in, if you're relying on IAF and the camera to find those eyes, that the camera's not doing any kind of searching with the focus ring because it could get on the background or it might get on something on the foreground. You want to make sure that it's already pretty close to where you want it so it spots that eyeball right away and locks right on. Next, we have this Roadside Hawk, and he's in a very fortunate position. We saw him as we were driving back towards the lodge on one of the roads, and this is just a really great opportunity because so many times in Costa Rica, you have so many branches and stuff in the background that it makes the photo very, very busy. We spotted him. He had a nice distant background. He was on a really nice perch. He's a beautiful bird. So we decided to stop and try to photograph him. Now, the background did have some splotchy white areas, so we got out of the van and we kind of maneuvered around so that we didn't have to worry about having those bright white spots behind him and pulling the viewer's eye away from the subject. And out of all the shots I took, and it was quite a few, I'm kind of embarrassed to say how many, it's probably over 500, 20 frames a second though, you got to remember that. But this was definitely my favorite. I really like the little head tilt. I like him looking right at the camera. I like his foot up. He's got that little feather on the other foot from his preening. I think it's just a very interesting shot. So, one of the things that I see happen a lot is that people will be out shooting something and they'll get a shot and they'll be like, oh, that looks nice. Then they'll move on because they're trying to collect as many specimens as they can in a given day. And, it pays to wait a little bit. We probably spent 15, 20 minutes with this guy before we left. We drove away. He did not fly off, but we spent some time with him to see what we would get. And it paid off because this was probably about halfway through the shoot where he gave us this look. After that, it was just kind of side profile shots from there. But, it is definitely worth hanging around and seeing if something interesting happens. Once again, this is a frame filling shot, just a 8x10 crop. The sides are not cropped at all. It's just the top and the bottom. As far as settings go, pretty straightforward. 1/400th of a second, 5.6, ISO 2000. I probably could have gotten away with 200th of a second. I think I did drop my shutter speed a little bit later, but I did not get this pose with that shutter speed, so I went with this shot. But that's one of the techniques that I use. We've talked about that before, is ISO insurance is what I call it, is get your shot and then drop your ISO, then shoot some more, get your shot, drop your ISO, and kind of keep ratcheting it down. But in this case, the pose was better at the ISO 2000 shot. And since I was filling the frame, no problem at all with noise reduction. Manual with auto ISO, -2/3 of a stop exposure compensation. Again, the background, if you see, is a little bit dark there. I did darken it a little bit in post. It wasn't quite that dark in real life, but it did require -2/3 of a stop of exposure compensation. And as for the autofocus, it was pretty straightforward. I just use a spot autofocus area, just a kind of a single point on the Sony. And I was in tracking mode, so it would spot the eye, it would get on the eye, and I could compose any way I wanted. Worked out real well, but I did keep that autofocus area around the eye in case the tracking started to fail or was jumping around too much. I could just do it manually, but in this case, it worked great. Stayed right on the eye, and those eyes are beautifully sharp. All right, we're about halfway through the video, but before we go on, I do want to mention that if you like this kind of information, if you're enjoying this video and you like to kind of get the background behind the shot and some of the challenges that had to be overcome in order to get it, make sure you follow me on Instagram, because when I post a photo over there, I always put that information in the description, in the caption of the photo. So just go to Instagram, follow Backcountry Gallery over there. I sure do appreciate it. And let's continue. Next, we have this little white-faced monkey, and we found him actually just around the corner from our lodge. He was right in town in Puerto Jimenez, and he was over there, and he was eating some palm fruits and stuff. I think that's why his mouth is open. I don't see any food in his mouth, but he was eating at the time. But I just love this expression, and I just thought it was really, really cute. He was kind of scratching his head, and he has his other hand out, and his mouth's wide open. Just a really, really fun shot. Now, there's a couple of little guidelines here I want to throw out. The first is that I have thousands, if not tens of thousands, of pictures of white-face monkeys, capuchin monkeys. But anytime that you get a large collection of a certain animal, there is a temptation just to pass on that animal when you see it out there as you're driving by. It's like, oh, I got white-faced monkeys. Well, the thing is, there's always a better shot. That's kind of my philosophy. There's always a better shot. So anytime I see an animal, no matter what it is and no matter how many photos I have it, I always do a quick evaluation. Is this worth stopping for? Is there potential here to get a better photo than I already have? And the answer here was yes. So we did stop, and we ended up taking some photos of them. The other lesson here is, one of the things I like to try to overcome with my workshop participants is a lot of people want to have the complete animal in the shot every single time they take a photograph. And a lot of times the best shots are actually when they're cropped in a little bit tighter. This is 600 millimeter, this is full frame. And I really, really like everything that's going on here. I like this kind of waist up shot. I don't need his feet. I don't need his tail. I don't need the bottom half of the monkey to make this photo work. And in fact, it wouldn't work as well, I don't think, if I had the entire monkey. So as far as settings go, just a 600 millimeter, I chose 1/800th of a second. It was plenty of shutter speed to keep everything sharp. ISO was a nice lowish 800, which was really nice. I used wide open at f4 just because the background was a little bit close here, and I wanted to make sure it was as blurry as possible. Manual with auto ISO with a negative 2/3 of a stop exposure compensation. As you can see, the background's a little bit on the dark side there, and that was kind of causing a little bit of an overexposure there. And AF was just a small spot with tracking and IAF enabled. So I'd put the little small AF area right on his eye, and then IAF would pick it up and tracking would pick it up, and I could move it all over the place and get, whatever composition I liked. But I do try to keep those little spot areas in the vicinity of the face and the eye there. That way, if tracking fails, I can just take over and just use it as a traditional AF point. Next, we have a pair of black-bellied whistling ducks, and these were actually taken from a pontoon boat. Part of our Costa Rica workshop tour goes down a river, the Sierpe River, and we're on pontoon boats, and we do some photography from those. However, it is a little bit of a challenge because you're hand-holding a 600 millimeter, in my case, from the boat, trying to get these ducks, and the boat's rocking and everything else. So there are a few extra challenges here. But some of the critical things we were looking at as we were coming up to these guys, once again, we were looking at backgrounds, and there was a lot of spotty areas, so we tried to get the boat as well as we could maneuver to a place where it was mostly a solid background. Sometimes the boat would move and we'd get some spots, but most of the time we were able to keep the background pretty solid. I really, really love the pose that these guys have going on here. I like the way their feet are wrapping around the perch, and I like the fact that the guy on top has his bill open just a little bit, and he's got his crown's a little bit up there too. That's really cool. And it's also raining, if you notice. There's some little tiny rain spots. And by the way, if you do want to capture those rain spots, you got to make sure they're on a dark background. If they're on a light background, you'll never see them. And even middle tone type backgrounds, you don't really see the rain quite as well. If you ever want to have an animal in the rain and really show that rain, make sure it's on a dark background. Now, if you want to show longer streaks of rain than what you see here, these are just little dots because I needed a fast shutter speed. But if you want to show longer streaks and the animal is still and you're still, like you're on a tripod, try something like 60th of a second, 1/25th of a second. It'll give you a little bit longer raindrop streak in the photo there. So the slower the shutter speed, the longer the streak. As for settings, 600 millimeter, as I said, 3200th of a second, mostly because these guys were about to take off and fly. I was actually thinking about a flight shot, but they were just kind of hesitating there, so I grabbed this shot before they took off. There's a bunch of them, and they were all taking off, and this particular pair was just kind of sitting there for a second. I got it before the flight shot happened, so that's why the fast shutter speed. Normally, I would try to lower the shutter speed a little bit. Even on a rocking boat, I probably could have gotten away with 1600 or 2000, but ISO was only 1600, so I'm not super concerned. Again, this is pretty much as shot. I just cropped the sides off to make the 8x10. Because of the darker background, I had to do a little bit of negative exposure compensation. And once again, I did darken the background just a little bit on this in post, just to kind of make the bird stand out a little bit better. My favorite auto exposure mode was used, manual plus auto ISO. And as far as the autofocus areas go, I was using medium spot tracking, basically with the idea that the bird was going to take off and I was going to follow it. But in this case, they both happened to be on the same focal plane. So when I photographed the top bird, the bottom bird was absolutely tack sharp. So that worked out really well. Sometimes you just get lucky on some of this stuff. And in case you're wondering, the flight shot didn't work out real well. They went the wrong way. Next, we have this southern lapwing in flight. And one of the things I like about this shot is that it showcases the little spurs on the wings really well. Whenever I have an animal that has kind of a unique attribute, I always like it when I can get a shot that kind of showcases that attribute, or at least lets you see that attribute. And in this case, I think you can see those spurs really well. I also like that his beak is wide open. I love that red eye. All of that's really good. I like the wing position too. And the reason I bring all of that up is because I want to talk a little tiny bit about frame rate. In this case, it was 20 frames a second. And I tell you, one of the things I did not expect when I started shooting 20 frames or even 30 frames a second is how many more unique images I could get by doing that. One of the things I've been telling people is it's not so much that with older cameras with slower frame rates, I wasn't getting great shots or keepers or anything like that. It just seems like with the higher frame rates, I'm getting better quality keepers, if that makes sense. So for instance, the shot right before and right after this, the beak didn't look nearly as nice as it does in this one. Now, had I been shooting 10 frames a second, I probably would have gotten one of those other shots. But with the 20 frames a second camera, I'm able to actually get those peak moments more often. So there definitely is an advantage to that, I think. Now, these lapwings were flying around, so the backgrounds were kind of all over the place. Some were dark, some were light. And if you notice, I'm in full manual mode, no auto ISO on this one. And the reason for that is because when you have a variety of different backgrounds, it's very easy for the camera to make mistakes. It's going to see a dark background and try to overexpose your subject. It's going to see a light background and try to underexpose your subject. None of that's good. So what I do is I just meter on some middle tone area that's in the same light as my subject, take that reading, dial it in manually, and then I just shoot away and not have to worry about it anymore. And that's what I ended up doing here. Shutter speed wise, 1/4000th of a second instead of 3200. I went a little bit faster just because it's a smaller bird and it's a little bit more difficult to keep it in the same place in the viewfinder as you pan. So I definitely needed a little more shutter speed for the faster bird. ISO was a pretty reasonable 1600. This was an APS-C crop though, so it did require a little bit of noise reduction afterwards. And it did work out pretty well. Even though it's an APS-C crop, it's still big enough in the frame that it wasn't bad at 1600. I would not have wanted to shoot it at something like 32 or 6400 certainly if I was going to crop that heavily. And finally, autofocus, just regular old zone autofocus on the Sony worked really well. Most of the time it even picked up their eyes, so that made it really easy to get these nice sharp photos. Next we have this backlit macaw in flight, and I know there's been a lot of flight shots in this video, and the reason for that is I was working on my bird and flight book while I was in Costa Rica, so that's why you're seeing so many of them. I was getting some more material for the book while I was down there, but really like the shot. I think it's my favorite of the trip. And we found these macaws. They were eating some palm fruits, and then they would take the palm fruit and then they would fly to a perch. And I noticed when they were flying to their perch, they would spread their wings like this, and there was a beautiful bit of backlight coming through. So I positioned myself, when I saw that, I positioned myself so that I could catch that photo as they were coming. So they would go to the palm fruit, and it was kind of a U-shaped flight pattern, and I would catch that second part of the U as they came in and were going up to their perches. So, and I was very close. This is a full frame shot. I cropped the sides off for the 8x10, but the top and bottom are unchanged. That's how tight this was. And it really turned out well. I really like the dark background. I really like how the wings look. Everything about this is really nice. The thing is, the metering was the tricky part. So what I did for metering, full manual mode, no auto ISO, and I just metered off kind of a patch of ground below where they were flying in, because some of the same hazy sunlight that was backlighting them was also hitting that ground. Straight up metering on this would have caused the bird to absolutely blow out. If you said, hey, camera, just do it, you would see that dark background and all those highlights would be gone. So I metered off the ground, and then I kind of tweaked it from there. I took a few shots. I think I saw some clipping, and then I, lowered it down maybe a third of a stop, and then it was all good to go. So sometimes you have to experiment with it and adjust it. And the clouds were kind of moving around and the density was changing. I had bright overcast the whole time, but you had to always look for zebra stripes in the case of the Sony, or blinkies if you're looking at it after the fact, to make sure you weren't clipping those highlights. So it was kind of a constant little bit of adjusting to make sure that everything was good. But this is kind of the result. And I was kind of on the underexposed side just a little bit. I was planning to bring it back up just a little bit in post, maybe half stop, 2/3 of a stop, just to make sure that I was protecting those highlights. Once again, 3200th of a second, my favorite shutter speed, especially for macaws. F4, ISO 1600. I didn't want that ISO to get too high because, again, I knew I was going to have to bring some of those shadows up in post. I didn't want them to get too noisy on me. And really, ISO 1600 was more than I wanted. I'd rather have been at 800, but I'm already wide open at f4, and 3200 was necessary to make sure you stopped all the motion. So it's always a juggling act. Autofocus mode was zone. And again, I would probably use zone tracking now rather than just regular zone, but zone does a really good job too about seeing those eyeballs and getting on those eyes. And it did here as well. In this photograph, the eyes are nice and tack sharp. So I think it worked out really well. And I think that's about it. That's the last one. So I hope you enjoyed this little presentation. And if you did, remember, follow me on Instagram. You'll get more of the same, just kind of shorter little tidbits of it. Also, if you enjoy birds in flight, I mentioned that book a minute ago, make sure you check out my bird in flight book. There's a ton of information. It's 500 pages, everything you'd ever want to know about photographing birds in flight. And it can take you to, I guess, bird in flight 0 to hero, just like that. Also, make sure you stop by the site, sign up for my free email newsletter so you never miss one of these videos, an article, workshop opportunity, or anything else I'm doing. And finally, as always, please make sure you like, subscribe, and get notified. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.